Ads schmads. If you don't want ads, that's okay. Choose the Dave McWilliams Plus option on Apple Podcasts. And hey presto, no ads.
To understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
A few light taps upon the pane made him turn to the window. It had begun to snow again. He watched sleepily the flakes, silver and dark, falling obliquely against the lamplight. The time had come for him to set out on his journey westward. Yes, the newspapers were right. Snow was general all over Ireland. It was falling on every part of the dark central plain, on the treeless hills, falling softly upon the bog of Allen, and farther westward, softly falling into the dark, mutinous Shannon waves. It was falling too upon every part of the lonely churchyard on the hill where Michael Fury lay buried. It lay thickly drifted on the crooked crosses and headstones, on the spears of the little gate, on the barren thorns. His soul swooned slowly as he heard the snow falling faintly through the universe and faintly falling like the descent of their last end upon all the living and the dead.
Wow, that's pretty powerful stuff, Mac. What is it?
Well, that was Shan Smith, my wife, reading the final paragraph in what is regarded by many, many scholars as the finest short story ever written.
Really?
Which was The Dead, the final short story in Dubliners by James Joyce.
Right.
Which Joyce wrote in and around 1906, 1907, when he'd arrived in Trieste and he was writing these short stories about his understanding about Dublin.
Yeah.
Right? So the reason I'm telling you this is Today is the first week of January. The Dead is set on the first week of January. It is snowing all over Ireland on the first week of January, 1907. It is today snowing all over Ireland.
Brass Monkeys.
It's Brass Monkeys. I also went to see an amazing production last night.
Right, okay.
A landmark theatre production company in the Museum of Literature in Ireland, which is in Ivy House in Stephen's Green. And I was so privileged to be there. It was the rendition of this short story, play of this short story, amazing acting, beautiful, the lighting, evocation, etc. Right?
Yeah.
And I was sitting there. I was actually standing. That was the amazing thing. Was you were part of the whole. You were part of the play.
Oh, I love it. It's kind of immersive.
Completely immersive, interactive. You're part of the whole thing, right? But I was listening to the words. Now, I'd read this, as you know, loads of times, years and years ago. And but I actually did my Ecker. I read it yesterday morning before I went. You have to do your Ecker beforehand. But there was a little bit in it, which was a speech given by the protagonist in 1907 at the end of this dinner.
Right.
And it was talking about how one generation couldn't understand the new generation. And it was talking about the new generation think very differently to the old generation. And it was basically talking about the generation gap, right? Yeah. And it was making the point that the generation gap in Ireland in 1907 was enormous. It was a gap of religion, John. It was a gap of nationalism versus unionism. It was a gap of modernity versus tradition. It was a gap of old versus young. It was a gap of country people against city people. It was a gap about the continent versus Ireland. Amazing, right? And I'm there thinking, as I'm always thinking, John.
Of course you are.
Of podcasts, right? And I thought to myself, isn't it fascinating that back in 1907, all these generational gaps were being contemplated, being agonized, etc. And it's exactly the same today.
Yes, yeah.
And Joyce was making the point, and the fascinating thing about this particular short story is the word newspaper is repeated again and again and again. You just heard that in Sean's piece there.
Yeah.
The newspapers
Brilliant.
have said, and what was happening back then was exactly what's happening now. So right now, our generation in particular are trying to understand what is going on in politics, what is going on in economics, what is going on in the way in which people are voting. So why, for example, in a country like the United States, which has never had it so good economically, they're all voting for somebody who's telling them it's all shite,
Yes.
right?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Why in England, when the economy isn't so bad, they're all voting for a guy in the Reform Party, Farage, who's telling them everything is awful, right?
Yeah.
Why is it the case across all of continental Europe, from Italy to France to Germany, where if you look at the metrics of quality of life, standard of living, provision of childcare, home care, education, all these things, there is an unambiguous statement of fact, which is the following. If you are lucky enough to have been born in Northwestern Europe in the last 50, 60, 70 years, you are the luckiest human who ever lived.
Yes.
Who ever lived, right? In terms of fighting wars, not fighting wars, in terms of the quality of life.
Yeah.
This is the most benighted part of the world that we have ever conceived of. And yet, we're all voting as if the end of the world is coming.
But why is that?
So here's the theory, John. And
Go
there's
on.
the link with Joyce, right?
Yes, yeah.
The theory is that I was prepared for many years to accept the idea of a reasonably robust economy, society, etc., would deliver a reasonably normal, in the center political system. But now we're seeing is loads and loads of people who are comfortably off are voting for people who are telling them their life is awful. Now, why is that? I think it's because they're hearing messages that their life is awful from lots and lots of new places.
Yeah.
Right? This is back to the newspaper idea of Joyce. If you look at the last 10 years, one of the biggest change in our life is that the gatekeepers of the message, the people who editorialized about society, who told us what to believe, in effect, right?
Yeah.
How to believe it and why to believe it, they have now gone from the very few to the very many.
Yeah.
Because the medium has changed. There was a fella called Marshall McLuhan, a Canadian advertising guy. And he was trying to explain in the 1950s how politics were shifting. And he said, the medium is the message. And what he meant by that was that television was the new medium.
Yeah.
And politicians like JFK, who looked good, who sounded good, the word, you can't imagine Gladstone or Daniel O'Connell ever using the word a soundbite.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Then suddenly the soundbite culture comes in. Can you look to the camera? Okay. So his idea was the medium is the message.
And Nixon in that one, when there was the brilliant piece of research done that the people who watched that debate on TV, JFK won it hands down, but the people who listened to it on radio, Nixon won it.
Exactly.
Because
Nixon was the better talker.
Yeah.
He was a much better talker. Right. So take that, right? What we've seen the last 5 or 6 years is the total proliferation of the message. There used to be 1 or 2 editors. There's now millions of editors.
Yeah.
There used to be 1 or 2 channels. There's now millions of channels. And it's no surprise that this week, the billionaires, the brotocracy we spoke about last week, who are prostrating themselves in front of Donald Trump are Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and Jeff Bezos. What they have in common is not just their wealth.
Spaceships.
They like a spaceship, right? Jiu-jitsu, spaceships, new wives, the whole thing, right? What they have in common is they are all newspaper men.
Yeah.
They are all people who understand we are in the attention economy. And what you need to do to be influential is grab the attention of people. So they have done what newspaper men did 120 odd years ago in James Joyce's time. They have changed the dynamic completely. Now, the beautiful thing about Joyce, what I think, is that when you're reading this, it's almost like he pre-envisaged what was going to happen. The First World War, communism, not just that, psychiatry, psychology, Freud, all these things, chemistry, the emergence of Einstein, the emergence of the nuclear age, all these things. But what Joyce is saying in this piece is that it is a generational gap. And I'll read you the thing that really sparked me last night, right? Because you can see I'm getting excited by this, right? It is.
Well, it's Joyce.
It's the speech by a fella called Gabriel Conroy, who is the main protagonist, a bit of a little goody two-shoes.
Right.
We wouldn't have liked him.
Yeah.
We wouldn't have liked him. But you can see the sort of personality, and the aunties who run the gig love him and everything. He's a great guy.
Yeah.
Okay. And he is called upon. You know these fellas who are called upon, you're sitting and somebody goes, and you think, oh, Jesus, no. Some old windbag is going to annoy me now with their musings of the world. They're kind of my end of year message, my beginning, right? Okay. So Conroy's taking this, and he's talking about the generational gap between his generation and the younger generation, which is something that we in our generation talk about all the time, right? And he says, ladies and gentlemen, John, he's got a barristorial, sort of the four courts accent, you know, the four courts accent, you know? If you only knew how intelligent I was, my lord. But anyway, he says, a new generation is growing in our midst, a generation actuated by new ideas and new principles. It is serious and enthusiastic for these new ideas, and its enthusiasm, even when it is misdirected, is, I believe, in the main sincere. Think about how pompous it is. Even when it's misdirected, I believe it is sincere, right? Okay, anyways, we are living in a skeptical and, if I may use the phrase, thought-tormented age. Now, this is the key, right? The age is changing, right? He says, and sometimes I fear that this new generation, educated or hyper-educated as it is, which you hear all the time now. Oh, they know lots of things, but can they put it together?
Yes, well, everyone has a master's.
Yeah, all that sort of thing, right? This will lack those qualities of humanity, hospitality, and kindly humor which belonged to an older day. Now, this is, of course, is tradition versus modernity. And I was listening, and it goes on for quite a while, as all these windbags go on, right?
Yeah.
But I was listening to that, I was thinking, wow, that is exactly the sort of thing that you hear in and around pubs and chat of one generation right now.
Yeah.
And he goes back and he identifies the major proliferation is this newspaper idea. So I was just sitting there thinking, isn't it extraordinary that what we find, so every generation is a bit narcissistic because they think their crisis is the big one or the new one, and no other generation has ever experienced this before, but that's not the case. All generations experience
just a different flavor of it.
Just a different flavor, this recurring thing. So we'll talk about newspapers in a minute back then. But what is clearly happening now is the medium is the message, and the medium has changed. And the medium, because it has changed, has allowed, encouraged, activated all these thousands of podcasters and substackers. Like when we were kids, John, in Ireland, the message was controlled by the Irish Times, the Irish Independent, RTE, right?
Yeah.
Maybe the Catholic Church, maybe maybe the education system.
Yeah, Christian Brothers, yeah.
But this was, they were the owners of the message. They told the truth, right? They told the country how to think. Now, the beauty of that is at least you could rebel against them.
Yeah.
But there were maybe 5, maybe 10 editors of public opinion in this country and every other Western democracy. Now, there are millions of editors.
Yeah.
The citizen journalist, everyone is an editor. And as long as you can compete for people's attention, you have an audience. And as long as you can then explain to that audience that they are not alone in the echo chamber that is social media, people then begin to think that their truth, to come back to this, is the truth.
Well, that's exactly it. And it's the echo chamber, that the proliferation of all these platforms and channels and blah, blah, blah. Obviously, you can't consume them all. So you go for the one that reinforces your own bias.
Exactly.
And you have this new claim of, this is my truth.
Yeah.
And your truth is only your opinion. There's no such thing as your truth.
Well, this is what Conroy is saying in The Dead. Now, The Dead itself, John, is well worth reading.
Yeah.
Simply because it deals with social issues, political issues, interfamily rivalry, jealousy, envy, all those beautiful things that make us human. And what Joyce saw as a very young man was these complexities of life. So the big epiphany. So epiphanies are essential in short story writing.
Yeah.
So short stories, because they're short, they need a moment where the whole thing changes.
Yeah.
So it's not like a novel. You can build and have plot and counterplot and la, right? I was actually just reading John Banville's April in Spain. If you want really good crime fiction.
Right.
John Banville has written these extraordinary stories about a fellow called Quirk, who was an alcoholic state pathologist, right? They're all based around him. Irish stories are great. Anyway, but Banville can work plot and everything else. But the short story needs to arrive at something. Yeah. And it's called the Epiphany. And every brilliant short story has one or two epiphanies in it. And in this one, it's an extraordinary epiphany where Conroy realizes through a scene with his wife, who he never really got to know, that his wife has been in love with somebody else all their marriage. And that man that she is in love with is dead.
Right.
And he really, read the story, but it's that idea that we never know who we are. We don't know who we live with. We can be with somebody all our lives and never really know them, or they never really know us. And the beautiful things about relationships are the secrets, the things that are not revealed.
Yeah.
And the great thing about great literature is it has this epiphany at the end against a backdrop of the snow falling all around Ireland. Even the Bog of Allen, John, is mentioned. Even the Bog of Allen.
It was beautifully read.
Yeah,
beautifully
and it's
read.
a beautiful piece. But for our purposes, as podcasters in the year of our Lord 2025, the interesting thing is what was happening to the economy then. And exactly the same is happening to the economy now, the global economy, and where it might lead us.
Well, let's talk about that and history repeating itself after a bit of this. So, Mac, we're talking there about Joyce and the dead and how history is repeating itself, and what he was writing back in 1907 is still incredibly relevant.
Yeah, and how the way the media changes.
Yes.
Changes everything.
Explain more about that, the media element of it.
So, in the period up to the last decade of the 19th century and into the first decade of the 20th century, we now know was a hinge period. So you're moving from one era to another era.
Yeah.
And the main economic driver of all this was industrialization. So the industrialization of the Industrial Revolution begins to generate a middle class, a class with a modicum of income. And with that modicum of income, they could do two things, which humans had never done before. Savings, which was an entirely new idea. And of course, with savings...
savings, just bank savings.
Savings. Most people never had any money to save, right?
Yeah.
An artisan might have had a few quid, but your average industrial labourer, your average agricultural labourer...
You spent what you earned.
And then you went on. So everybody was hungry and everybody was poor.
Yeah.
And then with the emergence of the Industrial Revolution, you begin to see the creation of what they called white-collar workers, right? And the white-collar worker was a clerical worker.
Yeah.
And why was that person existing? Two reasons. One was the emergence of the banking system, because you needed a place to put the savings. So the clerk annotated everything, number one. And number two was the emergence of bureaucracies, of state bureaucracies.
Right.
So you needed civil servants.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
They were the original white-collar workers. And then there was this basic idea that working in the white collar was slightly more elevated than working with your hands.
Yeah.
So the difference between the tradesman and the professional.
You didn't have to come home and wash.
Exactly, right? So all this is happening. Now, if there are savings, it means there are corresponding spendings. Back to the idea is that the way the economy works is that my spending will basically go into your pocket and you will save that, etc., right? So we begin to see the emergence. You remember we did a piece on casement a few years ago? Yeah. We talked about the emergence of the craze in bicycles.
Right? Yes. And Dunlop and his...
Dunlop, the other great middle class craze was pianos, right? So every self-respecting family had to have a piano in the corner. And all the children, particularly the girls, had to learn how to play piano. Yeah. Of course, Joyce was a great piano player and a great tenor. So he was involved.
Right, okay.
So, and you see the emergence in Ireland of this sort of posher Catholic schools which are emerging, the Blackrock colleges, the Clongowes. Yeah. All of this was to create and reinforce a professional Catholic middle class, which had never existed under the ascendancy and began to exist in Ireland. But Ireland was only a microcosm of what was happening all over the world, particularly in Central Europe.
Yeah.
So in Central Europe, what you're seeing is mass production of consumer goods. You're seeing for the first time, I think, the most fantastic, I know it sounds inconsequential,
Go on.
development in all of humanity, the supermarket, right?
Yeah,
You
yeah,
see
yeah.
the supermarket starting, you see the emergence of big department stores.
Yeah.
So grocers
was
went to
about
departments,
convenience and-
and but of course, department stores are based on the mass production of stuff. Now, what was being produced, ironically, was nostalgia. So you had all these, little ducks flying up the wall, right?
Oh, yeah,
Remember all
yeah.
those things, right? And you had prints
They were
of...
supposed to mean something. I never knew what it meant.
Nor did I, but I remember the houses they were in. You had prints of the great masters. The English became obsessed with Shakespeare, not modern
Right.
stuff. They were obsessed with looking to the past. Everyone was obsessed with Mozart. That's what they were playing all the time, and the classics. So what you had the mass production of consumer goods to service this new middle class. And this new middle class had affectations that they wanted to separate them from the working class. And those affectations were appreciations like playing the piano,
Yes.
knowing the classics,
Yeah.
talking about Mozart, all this, what we used to now call parlor games, right? Joyce was fascinated by this. And
Everybody had to have their little party piece.
Of course, you had to have your little party piece,
Yeah.
your hearts and flowers and one of those things,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
However, this is all the sort of cosmetic observations about sociology. But what was happening underneath this was a Vesuvian explosion in attitudes in tribes, right? So this idea that in the past there was poor people and rich people. But when the middle class emerged, the incipient bourgeois middle class that Marx so hated, who I believe are the key to everything, right?
Yeah.
I believe the bourgeoisie are the most fantastic class in the world. That's why myself and the Marxists never meet. Okay, maybe for a scoop every now and then. But the emergence of the bourgeoisie came with the emergence of tribes. Like, I'm that type of person. So I'm the sort of person who plays piano, or I have a bicycle, or all that sort of stuff, right? But you needed something to sell the products to these people. And newspapers at the beginning were simply sales documents. They were like the things that we used to get through the doors in the 70s and 80s, which was basically a list of bargains in Monkstown and Dunleary.
Yes. Yeah,
right?
yeah.
For
Brochures.
Brochures. Right?
Yeah.
So if you look like the Argos catalogue, they were the Argos catalogue, right? So if you look at, for example, the Irish Times from the 16th of June, 1904, which I have a copy of the front page, there's no news in it. It's all ads.
Really?
Yeah, it's all just ads. It's like bargains and tailors and blah, blah, blah.
So there's no headlines.
There's no headlines. So journalism came after advertising. We tend to think that journalism came first and advertising came second, but that wasn't the case. What happened all around the world, and this is a fantastic part of economic history, is the economic history of the media. Advertising came first, paid for by the industrial factories that were producing these goods. They realized that you can't basically sell shit to people all the time, okay? So you have to add something. What would we add? We'd add news, opinion. Now, what was that?
A few stories.
That was the attention economy in its incipient form. How do I grab this person's attention while they are on the 8 tram from the city centre to Dalkey, or the tram out to Howth, or the tram to Terenure, right?
Yeah.
What I do is I create background noise. What's that background noise? It's opinion. It's journalism. And what usually it was, and this is what Joyce did to make a crust, it was usually book reviews, classical theatre reviews, classical musical reviews. But all the while, you're selling. But then increasingly, what they realized is that people were actually in tribes. So you had to sell newspapers that had opinion on the left. Our opinion was anti-monarchist, or was pro-suffragette, or was pro-communist. It was pro-establishment. So suddenly you get newspapers becoming ideological not because they wanted to be ideological, but because they realized that part of the tribe were moving this way politically. And this is a fact. And also the amazing thing, John, is football clubs.
Right, yeah.
You see this explosion in football clubs,
Yeah.
right? And football clubs were partisan.
Well,
So-
they're the ultimate tribalism.
Exactly.
Of
so
the
Celtic
urban,
Rangers,
yeah, yeah.
right? Or, in England, Liverpool versus Everton. Or in Dublin, Shamrock Rovers, Bohemians. Totally different,
Yeah.
incipient understanding of where these teams, and Shelburne, where they came from.
So journalists prior to the early 1900s
Yeah.
were kind of more diarists then. and-
Pamphleteers. They were
Yeah.
pamphleteers who wrote to be paid for,
Yeah,
right? So you were paid for what you wrote. Advertising changed the whole game because advertising paid journalists, but more importantly, paid proprietors
yeah,
a fortune to push onto the middle classes consumer products that they never needed.
yeah,
And
yeah.
this is the beginning of consumerism. And this is a sort of an explosion of different ideas because consumerism is nothing more than tribalism.
Yeah,
Why do you look like that? Well, I look like this because I buy these sort of clothes because this is the sort of person I am, etc.
yeah.
So Joyce is capturing all this. But why it's relevant to today, exactly the same has happened today, except on a massively micro level.
Yeah.
So what happened there was a macro level. Political parties would be associated with football clubs and certain newspapers, and they would disseminate their information this way. Back to the idea of 5 or 6 big players. There's a reason that De Valera brought the evening press, because you needed your own bloody newspaper
Yeah.
to propagate your own ideas.
So this brings us to the likes of Jeff Bezos buying
Exactly,
the Washington Post because he
Exactly.
needs his own mouthpiece.
He needs his own mouthpiece.
and Musk with Twitter, etc., etc.
That's why Musk bought Twitter was for influence. It wasn't good enough to be some slightly overweight South African chap who puts rockets in the air, because frankly, that's not that important to people.
Yeah.
But what's important is owning the marketplace for ideas. That is Twitter, or
Yeah.
X as you now call it. Zuckerberg realized that Facebook was an advertising vehicle.
Yeah.
That was an advertising giant, but could only be an advertising giant if he had enough people on the site. So it was the ultimate network economy, right? And again, the Google guys are the same. They understand that Google is not a technology.
Yeah.
It's an advertising crib sheet.
Yeah.
And what makes Google important is the search engine drives the network, which allows them to upsell to everybody. And what I'm saying is,
So the advertising industry is the bedrock of all of the whole media industry and hence driving culture.
precisely. And the key thing of the advertising industry is we go into a shop or you go online and you think, I like that.
Yeah.
But the holy grail of advertising is to make you think, I am like that.
Yeah.
These are my people. But the serious point is what happened to societies when they became unmoored from the message was Armageddon. The
Ooh.
First World War,
Right.
eugenics, fascism, Nazism, all these isms that were fertilized by all these thousands of different
Yeah.
messages.
Yeah.
So the monarchists lost control of the debate. The Democrats lost control of the post-monarchical system. The nationalists took over. All this is in the dead, by the way, right? And it's the same thing as now. So you have Musk deciding now that Nigel Farage is not the right man for the Reform Party, but Tommy Robinson
Yes.
is the right man
Yeah.
in England. You have Musk, I'm just identifying Musk because he's more active in this area, deciding
becoming more
to
so, unfortunately.
write editorial pieces in the German newspapers saying the alternative for Deutschland is the only way forward,
Yeah.
right? You have Musk, Trump flirting with Meloni, and she's flirting back with them in what's it called? Mar-a-Lago?
Mar-a-Lago, yeah.
Mar-a-Lago, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
exactly. I always think it's Marza Allah, the mouth of Allah. All this is happening because of the medium has changed and the messenger has changed. So I was watching the other day the BBC, which should be the mouthpiece of the British establishment. Its main headline story yesterday was on Elon Musk.
Oh, yes.
So not only, right. So, and again, at the top of this, you have the sun god, Mr. Trump.
Yeah.
And they are all, it's basically like, I mean, Tom Frank spoke to us a few months ago about the Republican convention, and he was saying it was like the emperor.
He was sitting in his throne.
He was sitting in his throne.
Yeah.
Right now, today, Dana White, the head of UFC, has been put on the board of Meta, Facebook, one of the biggest media companies in the world.
He should be on the door, actually.
He probably should be on the door. But,
Yeah.
you know, Joe Rogan, many people would say, won the election for Trump.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so it's a proliferation.
But what you're saying, though, is that Joyce identified back in the early 1900s, 1907, that this was a major change.
And would lead to catastrophe.
But are you saying now that we're going through the same change and God knows where we're going to go? Or?
Absolutely. I think we are moving. You remember this idea? So Joyce is all about modernism.
Yeah.
So we create the new, we dispense with the old, we look at the new forms, etc., in art and literature and music and all that sort of stuff. But what he identified and what he was a creature of change.
Yeah.
And I think our generation, the generation coming behind us, are creatures of change. And where that change takes us, we are not 100% sure. But I can tell you one thing for definite. The people who believe we're going to go back to the same. So there are many unfortunate statisticians at work in the forecasting game. And they believe in a thing called mean reversal, or reversing to the mean, right?
Okay.
So that basically what you have is in statistics, so it's that basically things go out there and then they revert back to the mean, right? I don't
Pendulum kind of swings.
Pendulum swings and we go back. You know, we go radical and then we go back. I don't think that's the way the world works. I think the world works in massive steps which look radical but are not. So basically, things that seemed radical yesterday become mainstream in these periods of massive change.
Yeah.
And things that were mainstream become redundant. And that, John, is the world we are going into.